Hello, everyone. We're back for Clektive Thinking today, and I'm joined by Elliott after his break for the last episode. Now, since we last spoke, Elliott, Snowflake Summit has actually taken place. So for today's episode, we're going to focus on that, and we're going to start by talking about some of the announcements from Snowflake's flagship event. Let's jump straight into it there, and let's start with a bit of a kind of setting the scene, if you like, for those that are listening that might not know what Snowflake Summit is or what it's all about. So if we can start with a bit of an overview from your side, because I know you've been listening into the event online, haven't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's an interesting one. So yes, so Snowflake Summit, there's a collection of like world tour and different events that Snowflake does. Quite a lot. It's really big in the community. Lots going on. But Summit at this time of year, it's in San Francisco. It's huge. 20,000 people attend. It's where they do really the big announcements and the sort of direction of travel where Snowflake goes for the next sort of 12 and so months. So yeah, really, really interesting. So there's hundreds of sessions, loads of speakers. But what was really interesting about it was the energy this year was like different to previous years. So yeah, you can certainly watch it on YouTube, and that's what I did. I sort of listened to the sort of a keynote. I listened to the platform keynote the day after. It's a 4-day event. So what was really, really interesting was, if I think about 2025's, it was very much, look what you could do with AI. Yeah, that's great. And I think we've spoken a load of episodes about different things you can do with Cortex functions and stuff like that, trying to keep it out of the detail. But this year was really interesting because it was more around, this is what you can do, but actually this is what really AI is now doing, what it can do in production, how people are using it. And, the last year, as we talked to on our previous episodes, had so many changes. And actually, it's sort of, I would say, culminated into the summit to sort of say, okay, actually, this is what's amazing and this is what's available. And I mean, I think what's really cool as well was there was loads of announcements, but the key announcements I would say was, we talked about Snowflake Intelligence before. That's been renamed, and that's been sort of repackaged, you could essentially say, into CoWork. So Snowflake CoWork. And then, Cortex Code came about previously, sort of like December or so of, I want to say 2024 even, right? But what was really interesting was that's now gone back to what it was originally its project name, which was called CoCo, which is really, really nice. So it's, although not necessarily from a code perspective change, but more from a CoWork, something that's new, and that was really interesting. And I think that's going to be something that I think sort of business leaders and organizations thinking about Snowflake, working Snowflake, it's going to really, really matter.
Brilliant. No, thanks, Elliott. Now, on that note, we obviously here at Collect, we talk a lot about change, both on the podcast and at work generally. We know there's a lot happening at Snowflake. And I think, as you just touched on, right, it was a 4-day event. There was a lot of announcements coming out of that. What do you think from your perspective? I know you were listening in. What did you find were the key kind of takeaways or themes that you found particularly insightful?
Well, I think it's probably worth to sort of step back and just at a really high level, they introduced this sort of concept of a builder and this concept of a knowledge worker a bit more.
Okay.
And Summit's always been centered around the builder. Yeah, a builder being someone who works as a data engineer or as a developer or as a technical analyst. They work inside of Snowflake. They work on the nuts and bolts, you could say. They're the ones building what would be the agents, the data models, the applications. But then you have this new paradigm, which is the knowledge worker, who really is the bucket of everyone else, right? You've got the executives, you've got the sales teams, you've got the HR function or whatnot that really want to utilize that information. They don't want to build, they want to use that information to to achieve business outcomes, right? And so they need to be able to use it, they need to be able to trust it, they need to be able to act on it. And that's probably in terms of sort of at a high level, really important themes to sort of consider here, especially around where they're now talking about CoCo and they're talking about CoWork. Some of the other sort of things that I think really I sort of saw from Summit was we are moving into this sort of agentic enterprise space. We're really all about the idea that, agentic enterprise was talked about everywhere in some way, shape or form, and I think that is less about being a chatbot centered. It's around doing something. And I think that was really one of the sort of big ways that I looked at Summit.
No, it's really interesting, actually. It's a really good point. And I want to touch on that a little bit more, if I may, about the kind of agentic enterprise, because, it's something where we hear this term a lot. And I think even if we take it back to just AI in general, right, we hear about generative AI, agentic AI. I think we all know the generative side. I think we've come to grips with that now, whether it's Will Smith eating spaghetti, helping you write your email, whatever it might be on that kind of scale of use of things like ChatGPT and other tools. But I'm keen to touch on a bit more about agentic AI and specifically, as you mentioned there, the agentic enterprise. What is different when it comes to agentic workloads? And again, what do kind of businesses really need to focus on here around this buzz term that we're hearing more and more about at the moment?
Yeah, and I get that it could probably sound a little bit buzzy, but it does have a clear distinction. So I think, like I just said, less of a chatbot, but actually, the idea is that you have your data in Snowflake, but you have all this semantic information and all this sort of elements that relate to data, your own intelligence as a business. And what that's about is that by providing that information, providing your data in a space, being able to work with agents so that actually you have that layer of intelligence that can watch things that are a part of the data, spot what things might be going right, might be going wrong, and being able to do something about it, being an action. So when we talk about sort of agentic enterprise, it is different because it's about describing, that the business isn't just querying to get an answer. It's about being able to continuously ask questions, but continuously take action upon information as well, without necessarily needing human. You can set a piece of work off, leave it, come back to it, you've received it. And that's where I say that sort of CoWork paradigm really comes to play, because you'll be able to, and as it said within the summit, and as we saw with some of the videos, and I'd encourage anyone on the podcast to have a watch of any of those videos that you do find on YouTube. Being able to work with your data on your desktop or your mobile, be able to generate dashboards, be able to generate artifacts, be able to reoccurringly ask a question. That's really powerful, and I know we said we'd sort of talk less about the tech and more about it from a C-suite perspective. If I'm like a CFO and I want to monitor, I've got a Monday board pack I've got to create, or I've got to put commentary towards last week's trading, I can use CoWork to schedule that kind of stuff. That's going to save me time. But because it's been built with my data, built with my understanding and my semantics that have been agreed as an organization, I'm able to get to more interesting, or being able to read that information and take action, not spend time trying to build that. If I was a CEO, if I'm thinking I usually get weekly updates, or I have to pass a request to a data team and then I have to wait. Well, having CoWork, having again your data organized, having the semantics in the same place, and having CoWork, I'm going to be able to go, actually, do you know what? I can go and ask that question, and it's going to be able to give me the rationale behind how it worked, be able to provide me the answer I look for. I think this is a really interesting time because, people like to learn differently. People like to operate differently. From an education perspective, when I used to work in education, you have, auditory learners, you've got visual learners. Actually, we're in a position where you're going to be able to start to get your data from very different ways. You're still going to get the same answer, still going to be trusted, but you're going to get it in a way that means it's digestible for you. And that's really powerful. I think that's where I say the agentic enterprise, that's the promise, you could say. We saw that a lot at Summit. It was really interesting.
And I think there's certainly a lot of application in terms of, removing the manual input required into a lot of those repetitive tasks and the amount of time that can be saved. You mentioned one use case there, right? Building out a board pack for the CFO. Think of how many other use cases, think of how many other things that could be streamlined and just remove that manual process to free up that time to do more, compelling and more kind of thought-provoking activities rather than got to go and wrangle a load of data and put it into a pack ready to share. So yeah, I can definitely see that. On the flip side of that though, do you think, and this is your opinion of course, but do you think businesses are truly ready for the agentic era and the kind of, opportunity that is at hand here?
Some businesses will be, some businesses won't. From Summit, they're obviously going to bring up the people that are able and are doing it to demonstrate to the world that this is possible, that there's a degree of effort and time and investment that's going to be needed. You don't want to build your agentic enterprise on fragmented, ungoverned, half-trusted data. You want to be able to put that data to work. You want to be able to bring about efficiency in your organization with data. Well, you don't want to do that based on bad decisions. You want to be able to feel confidence in saying, I've built this agent, or I've got this agent, I've got my data. I know that if I'm going to be looking at, and we've talked about it on a previous episode, but profit by one person means profit to another person, depending on the lens by which you're using it. So actually, it becomes really important. It's not just even the data now. It's about all that semantic understanding so that actually that agent has the best chance to provide you exactly what you need now. Hopefully that's answered your question, Chris.
Yeah, no, definitely it has. And I think, again, it's like you say, it is dependent, isn't it, on each organization and their kind of data maturity. We've touched on things previously like the semantic layer and other things that you've mentioned in terms of that data readiness to really optimize and maximize the use of this technology. I guess I'm going to, again, take it a kind of a step further away from the detail, but how do we cut through some of that noise, Elliot? We've touched about there some really interesting topics around the kind of agentic enterprise, around knowledge workers and builders. How do we, for an organization, for a business, for someone that might be listening who's representing one of those organizations, how do they kind of grasp this opportunity and use that moving forward?
Really great question. I think the thing to remember and to be able to grasp it, you've got to understand what is it you're wanting to achieve. Yeah. So again, it's stepping really back to say, we could put CoWork to action right now. Right, we've got our data in. We don't know if there's any data quality issues. We can get on with it. But actually, what I'd actually probably do is if I was in any organization where I didn't know if I felt confident in the data or confident in the semantics just yet, that semantic layer, I would actually use CoWork to actually start to build out my business use cases. I might look to use it to sort of test or validate some of my working assumptions. And then I would look to start to build out a plan working collaboratively across different departments. Or if you're at a C-suite, working with the board to say, how do we want to tackle this? Some organizations, and at Summit, there were lots of big names that were presenting and talking about how, they're being significantly impacted in a really positive way by agentic enterprise and by agents now. But the thing is, it's about understanding and starting small. What is the data sets that are going to matter? What are the metrics that are going to matter? How do we get started there? And then you build it up over time. Now, you can obviously work with people like us, of course, who can help you in that area. But in the same way, that's a way you go about it. But the thing with it and having agentic enterprise and having agents, you can arrange things. You can organize automated daily routines, as an example. You can have things like meeting summaries. You could be looking at things like how you draft communications. The opportunities become somewhat endless. But in the same way, that can be really scary for a big enterprise. So it's just about taking the time and working with people to do it. Let's work together collaboratively to ensure that we get it right, because there's risks if you don't. But, there's a lot of guardrails coming up. There's a lot of new features that will be able to support ensuring that AI provides you with an accurate answer. But I'm getting stuck in the detail again, Chris, aren't I? So
no, it's really good. Don't worry, I'm here to kind of pull you out of that. And it is really interesting insight there you mentioned, because I think what you stress there that's quite interesting is like governance in general. Building with the outcome in mind is the first bit, right? What do we want to achieve from any AI projects or initiatives that we're looking at? But you also started to touch on there on that governance piece. And again, what might be interesting to just reference there, Elliot, is kind of the collect approach to AI. You mentioned from our side what we do, and it's that kind of assisted intelligence, isn't it? It's building using AI, things like agentic AI, but it's there to support the humans that are empowering it and that are, ultimately using it. And maybe that might just be a kind of nice way to kind of sum this up in terms of, of the things we're seeing from the likes of Snowflake Summit, how is that impacting an organization like Clekt, where we're starting to, kind of use some of these initiatives and use AI in more kind of interesting and different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all things AI, it's about, and I think we've talked about it previous, it's about ensuring that you're able to determine the sort of ROI of what you're looking to do with AI.
Yeah.
Agents are going to provide you with an opportunity to do a lot more, a lot faster. That was really talked about in keynotes and throughout Summit. But, the key thing here is understanding the ROI, understanding, although you can have agents, one of the things I got really is that it comes back to the age-old adage that, your data is important. We've got frontier models. We've got, Anthropic were in the Summit talks, but, you've got all the big players. You've got OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, all the big players that you can use within Snowflake as part of your sort of agentic enterprise. So what really matters and what's going to give you that competitive edge is having that data, having it in a well-governed way, having all of what we're saying, what we've preached about previously in there. It's so, so important. Every business is going to have access to the same model. How you get the best output is using the amazing features that have been announced. And I think, like I say, that's going to really be the differentiator here in building what you want. But again, back to what does this look like? What do we mean by this? Is that if you were like, I sort of think about it if I really think about it from like the CTO standpoint, we're going to have an AI stack, right? We're going to have some models. That's really, really great. You still need the data as close to the model as possible. That's where Snowflake comes really beneficial. But then if I'm a revenue officer or if I'm a CEO again, and I want to be able to actually query that data or query and actually go and get me what were the sales for the weekend, I want to be able to trust it. So it's gonna give you whatever you want, but it's gonna have to be in terms of the model, right? In terms of the data that's available. So I think from an organization standpoint, that's really key. And I think, as I say, there's more and more coming out from Summit that will just help this year.
Definitely. And if I can summarize that, I think from my perspective, what I'm hearing is the question's almost shifted, hasn't it? From what can I do with AI? To your point earlier, it's almost limitless now. What can be done with AI? It's how do I get myself and my data and the governance and everything that's wrapped around it set up and ready and have the quality and the assurance and the trust to go and just really run with that and use this new technology as it's released and as it comes out to really power my business. And for all those things we've mentioned, whether it's time savings, removing manual inputs on repetitive tasks, the opportunities are there. It's just setting yourself up to make sure it's successful when you go for it, isn't it?
100%. I mean, I wrote it down. So there's two things that I've written down that really sort of I really got from the sort of the keynotes. One of them was around one of the people presenting was saying that 85% of enterprise clients arrive with a data problem before an AI problem.
Yeah.
So although you want to deal with AI and you want to work in this, they got a data problem.
Yeah.
Get the data right, that's going to work. But then I think one of the other things that really sort of jumped out at me from Summit was also this concept of what's important now. And looking at that agentic enterprise is really important because you want to get there. But it's the journey by which you take to get there. So what's important now to get right so that you can get going. And with governance, there was so much about the fact that it cannot be seen as a break. It can't be seen as the thing that is going to impact progress as an organization towards that enterprise sort of space that you want to enter. But it is to really support you and actually get you the best value from what you want in the future.
No, I completely agree. So, if I'm going to use a final analogy, it's almost like AI has always been the shiny toy in the distance. And now we've got to the toy. We need to make sure we've got the batteries right. We need to make sure we've got everything that powers 100%. It and make sure it works and make sure it comes up with what we ultimately want in terms of the outcome. No, I like it. I probably super simplified it there at the end, but I think that's a good way to sum it up. I think that's about all we've got time for in terms of today's episode, Elliott. So thank you very much. Once again, your insight into this has been really interesting. I know it's difficult to kind of absorb so much information across 4 days. So your ability to kind of listen in and break that down for us is really helpful. Obviously, there's much more that's come out of the summit, and I'm sure there's a lot more that we'll be covering as from our side. So if anyone does want more information about the summit, about what's going on at Snowflake, it'll all be available on our website and on our socials, and you'll be able to find more information there. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks all.